This is Dr. Trussell, and here I'm going to go through a quick overview of Chapter 9 of Giancola's Program Evaluation textbook. This evaluation is part 1 of implementation, implementing the evaluation. So implementing an evaluation, we have learned about our program, we've designed our evaluation questions, and our designed our evaluation, how we're going to go about the process, and now we start to actually do the thing. So the first step in that, before you start to do anything involving humans, you have to, or will want to, in almost all situations, there are some exceptions to this, but when possible, it's best practice to get consent, informed consent. So you get an individual's agreement to participate in an evaluation with full knowledge of the potential benefits or risk. This is a key tenet in the principles of research ethics, making sure that you respect the people involved. So this key principle of respect for persons, informed consent, recognizes an individual's autonomy and empowers participants to make free decisions with all the necessary information for them to make those decisions. So you're not just getting consent, you're getting informed consent. So you introduce yourself, you tell them a general summary of the project's aims, what you're expecting to do, what you're going to ask them to do, and how the findings will be used. Then you give an informed consent form to the individuals, let them read through it, which it should also include that information about the program, what they're signing up for, and also gives them the right to stop at any point if they become comfortable. So just because you started participating doesn't mean you have to finish all the way through the end. You can choose to stop at any point. That's part of informed consent. So you're going to invite them to ask questions about what you're going to do to make them as comfortable as possible with the fact that they have all the necessary information to make a decision about whether they want to participate or not. And then you'll give them the consent form for their signature. If they do choose to consent, choose to participate, they'll sign giving their consent. In some cases, the participants may be persons under the age of 18 or may have some other reason that they're not able to give legal consent. And in that case, you would get a consent form from a parent or guardian, but you'd also get an assent form from the individual who's actually participating. You give them the same sort of process of explaining to them what's going to happen, giving them the opportunity to say yes or no, even though they can't technically legally give consent. Their guardian would do that for them. You still want to be sure that they are respected and given the opportunity to assent to be part of the program or not. And you in fact give them an assent form, which is a document that they can sign or use to agree to participate. There are active or passive consent. It's typically thought that active consent is the desired version of consent. This is where consent is documented through signing of a consent form. Passive consent, which is sometimes thought to be unethical or at least ethically questionable, is where consent is assumed due to an individual's voluntary participation after they've been informed about the evaluation. So you give them all the information about what's going to go on. So it's still informed consent, but it's passive in a sense that they didn't technically sign and say, yes, I want to consent. They just didn't say no. And so you assume a yes, which is not, as you can imagine, not as safe an assumption as if they've given active consent. So I won't go through all the pieces on this table, but this is from your text, and it just gives some good best practices for informed consent, what you should do as part of the consent process and what you should not do, or things you should avoid in the consent process. So once you've gotten consent, you can start collecting data. And there are several different ways of doing that. One is through survey instruments or existing data. So surveys are questionnaires. Most of us have been exposed to surveys at some point in our lives. These are questionnaires that give participants a standard set of questions and response categories. They're pretty efficient for collecting data because they're straightforward. They can get data from a lot of people in a short amount of time, and they can be done at a relatively low cost. Administration of the survey can be done by mail, over the phone. It can be part of an interview. It can be done on email. You choose your mode depending on your cost, how much time you have, and who you're surveying, and what kind of access to technology they may or may not have. Will help determine as well how you administer the survey. And something that's key in getting a good response rate. So your response rate is the percent of all those that you sent the survey to who actually respond to it. If you want a good response rate, if you want a lot of folks to respond, one thing that's key in survey administration is follow-up. Especially if a survey is administered electronically, you want to monitor how many people have taken the survey, and you want to send follow-ups to remind them and keep requesting that they participate. Although the textbook says that this author and her team have found that after about 3 follow-ups, you don't really increase your response rate very much if you continue to go. You might just annoy folks. So you want to be strategic with your follow-ups, but you do want to follow up. So you also can use existing data as part of your data collection process. So these are data that are collected on an ongoing basis by an institution or an agency, and you might enter into a data sharing agreement between the evaluator and the organization that stipulates how data necessary to the evaluation might be shared, protected, and used. So if it's data that your program or your institution already are collecting and you want to get access to that, you can, and typically there will be some sort of agreement around that about, okay, how are you going to use it, who are you going to share it with, how are you going to protect it. So that's surveys and existing data. Another way to collect data would be an interview or a focus group. These are verbal exchanges. Interviews, specifically, verbal exchanges that are guided by questions on a particular topic. A structured interview uses an interview protocol, which is a list of predetermined questions that are asked in the predetermined order. The protocol usually has some primary questions as well as a series of related questions, which are called probes. So probes are follow-up questions where you explore responses in more detail. So all of those things would be included in your interview protocol so that everyone you interview gets exactly the same questions. And not everyone might get exactly the same probes because those probes may depend on their answers to the primary questions. But you have the same sort of pool of probing questions from which you're asking to each interviewee. So that's a structured interview where everything is already all the questions are predetermined and they're asked in the same order to every interviewee. An unstructured interviewee lets the researcher shape the interview around the unique perspective of the respondent. You can probe and follow up on questions that emerge during the interview. So you're likely going to walk into an unstructured interview with a handful of questions that you have prepared and that you will be asking to at least sort of open up the conversation, but you don't necessarily go through a protocol in the same structure that you do in a structured interview. You ask the question, and depending on their responses, you may ask different follow-up questions to sort of get deeper, get more information that's unique to each of your interviewees. Another form of data collection that's similar to interviews is a focus group. But a focus group is sort of like an interview, usually sort of less structured, but it's conducted with a small group of individuals rather than one individual at a time. So 6 to 8 individuals brought together to answer questions about a specific topic. So focus groups can be used for a lot of purposes in evaluation, like to understand a program, a problem, or a phenomenon from a certain group's point of view, to inform your logic model development in the very beginning, to provide formative feedback for a particular program, to ask a group, what do you think about how this is working, and how we might improve it, or to inform future research methods, helping to determine topics for a future survey. So you can ask your group, hey, what are the things you're thinking about around this particular program? And that helps you then to form maybe the questions you want to ask to a broader audience. Focus groups are led by or facilitated by a facilitator. This is the interviewer in a focus group, not only responsible for following the protocol, but also for moderating discussion in a productive and constructive way. It takes a lot of practice to become a skilled facilitator. It requires strong listening skills, the ability to manage group discussions, experience with conflict resolution, and an understanding of nonverbal communication. So if anyone is interested in becoming a facilitator, that's something that you would most likely want to sort of apprentice under someone who's good at it, and learn from experience. There's certainly some things about this that you can learn from textbook learning, but a lot of it's learned. A lot of those skills are learned through experience, listening, and watching, observing in focus groups. When you're deciding whether to include interviews or focus groups in an evaluation, might depend on several things, like whether you have the resources to conduct and analyze the data from interviews and focus groups. Certainly more time-consuming than something like a quick survey. Consider the comfort of your participants. Are they willing to? Do they want to be interviewed face-to-face or in a group? Or would they prefer just to be asked questions at home on their computer, right? Based on their comfort level, how are you going to get the best, most accurate information from them? Even if it might be ideal to get the kind of depth of information that you could get from an interview or focus group, if they're not comfortable, you're not going to get that. So you also want to consider the number of people or groups of people that you're wanting to interview. If you've got a whole lot of folks, then it might be more efficient to group them into focus groups than to try to do them one at a time. If you've got even more than that, you may just want to stick with surveys. And consider the kind of information you need to collect. Is it something you can collect with a survey? If so, probably just stick with that, because it is more efficient, cheaper, faster, and in many times more comfortable for the participants. But if you really need that sort of depth of probing that an interview or focus group allows you to do, then that may be the way you need to go. So we've got surveys, existing data, we've got interviews and focus groups. Another way to collect data is through observations or program documentation. So observations, just information, just what it sounds like. It's just information learned by seeing or watching something. In evaluations, they're either formal, using a protocol or a checklist, am I seeing what I'm looking for, or they're very informal, where you get more of a free-flowing description of what you're watching, what you're seeing, what you're observing. They enroll in a participant observation versus a non-participant observation. Just depends on the role that the researcher takes. A participant observation involves the researcher taking on an active role in the setting while collecting data, and a non-participant observation is characterized by the researcher not intruding on the setting and just sort of being a fly on the wall and watching what's going on. So that's observation. Program documentation is another way to collect data. Resources that can be used for purposes of determining the rationale of a program, learning a program's history, understanding facts about why a program is the way it is, confirming the stakeholders who are involved. So documents like existing records, meeting minutes, annual reports, handbooks, diagrams, strategic plans, things like that that already exist within an organization. Advantages of using documents are, well, one, they might be more reliable than people. They're not going to forget things. Two, they can save time and money because you've got information that you now don't have to go out and collect. And three, they might be more accessible than people. Sometimes they're posted on websites or in public spaces, and you don't have to dig so hard for them as you might have to exert more effort to go find the people to ask. The downside, of course, of a document is you can't ask probing questions of a document, and you can't do the open-ended thing with a document. You just, whatever information is there is what you've got. But still, oftentimes a good place to start. See what you can collect from the things that are already there. The program documentation and the existing data are great places to start that are sort of low-hanging fruit. What do we already have? Before you start to spend time and money on collecting more. So now we've collected our data, and it's really crucial that we get the next step right. We have to organize our data. So if we want an evaluation that in the end makes sense, we've put all this time and effort into, and perhaps money into collecting data. And if we don't organize it well so that we can analyze it effectively and usefully, we've wasted all of our time to this point. So we've got our data, now we want to organize it. So we have variables. So first of all, we'll look at how to organize quantitative data. Remember, these are the numbers types of data. So variables are data elements that can be measured and have different values. The values of the variable, each data element is a different variable, and each variable has different values. So values could range from 0 to the total number of counseling sessions offered, or they might be 0 for no and 1 for yes, right? So what are all the possible values of your variable? You'll have those in the data you collect, and you want to record them either electronically, and this is especially, it's made much simpler if you collected your data electronically. So if you used say an email survey, you may have already a document of a record of the data, a spreadsheet of some sort that just comes out electronically from your data collection. If not, if you haven't used electronic data collection, then you might need to record your data directly into a spreadsheet or some data analysis software using from paper surveys. Some member of your team would either have to scan those surveys or enter the data by hand. It's important to make sure you have procedures that check your data quality as you enter the data. You'll want to make sure that the data that you see makes sense. So if you've got, for example, a variable whose values are 1 and 0 for yes and no, you want to make sure that when you're putting in that data, you don't get a 3, right? You should only have a 1 or a 0. And as you record your data, or maybe even before you start the process of recording your data, if you're inputting paper surveys or something into the thing, into a spreadsheet, you also want to have a code book. So a code book is a separate file that records the variable name for each data element, the item or question that was used to collect the data, and how the data were coded when prepared for analysis. So if the possible answers on the survey were yes and no, then you want to have in your code book how you coded that, where yes equals 1 and no equals 0. So your code book is sort of like the legend on a map that says this is what these different things mean. Your code book does that for organizing your data, and it's really, really essential for making sure that people other than you are able to understand your data later. You want to make sure that you code clean. which means you check the data to make sure it's accurate. So as I was saying before, you want to make sure that a variable that's only supposed to have a 0 or 1 only has a 0 or 1. You want to make sure you've got valid values. You also want to figure out your procedure for handling invalid values. So if you find a 3 where there should just be a 0 or 1, what are you going to do about that? You need to be sure that you document how you handle those situations. You don't just want to willy-nilly, oh, I'm sure they meant 1, right? Now you end up with falsified data and all sorts of issues with the validity of your results in the end. So you want to have a procedure for how you handle those things. Do you just throw those values out completely? Do you take the 3 out and consider that just a missing value, but leave the rest of that data record in there? Do you go try to find out what the correct answer actually is? And in that case, if you can, then do that. You certainly want to replace it with the correct answer if you know the correct answer. But if you don't want to pretend that you do. So you don't want to just change the value to something that makes sense to you if you don't know for sure that it would be truly the correct value there. But you always want to document what you did do. If you found an invalid value, how did you handle that? You want to make sure that you have that documented so that anyone who follows up understands your results. Anyone who wants to try to replicate your analysis or has questions about how data were analyzed, you're able to answer those questions. And just maintain the integrity of your evaluation. So you want to check your data, you want to input your data, you want to check your data. You want to be sure that you store it in a way that makes sense. You want to place your files in clearly labeled electronic folders. You want to ensure that the data can be retrieved easily. Be sure to put files in clearly labeled folders with clear labels on the files themselves. And you want to make sure that you use consistent formats. You want to have a folder where you keep all your raw data, just like it came in, and then a separate folder where you keep your cleaned data, where after you've gone through and checked for validity and made those changes where you found invalid entries, that should be in a separate folder. You never want to compromise your original raw data because you may have to go back to the drawing board at some point, so keep that somewhere, but then also keep your copies of your cleaned up data in separate folders and have them labeled appropriately. The file names should incorporate the type of data and the date it was last used. But really most important is that you choose a consistent format and that everybody on your team understands and uses that same format. You want a file naming scheme, and you want to make sure that the names of your files don't include any individually identifying information, so that you're not compromising people's privacy either in your data. When it comes to qualitative data, it's much trickier to code this data because now you've got interviews, you've got focus groups, you may have audio files, right? But you still want to be sure that you are tracking all of the data that you collect. It's important to make sure you've collected all the data you need. A lot of times with qualitative data, that quality checking happens on a more continual basis than just once after you've received all your surveys. When it comes to more quantitative stuff, you might data check as the data are being collected, immediately after data collection or after the analysis. The data quality reviews could happen at any stage once the data collection takes place. Reviewing transcripts in the middle of the project to make sure all the questions are being answered adequately. You could have 2 observers discussing their observations to make sure they captured the setting accurately. Or you may, after the analysis is complete, come back and do checks where the evaluator asks study participants to review early findings for accuracy. So data quality checking often happens or more continually when it comes to qualitative data than with quantitative data. But equally important, you want to be sure that the quality of your data is upheld in order to have a quality evaluation. So part of the process in working with qualitative data files is including a tracking document as you collect data like this. So you may have a list or a spreadsheet that says, I interviewed this person on this day at this place. Here's who actually did the interview, and here's the name of the file where I stored that, right? The date that I did it. So where you're just tracking everything that's going on through your qualitative data collection process. And that way you keep things somewhat organized, at least. Just like with quantitative data, you want to be sure that your qualitative data files are stored using some file naming structure that everybody on the team understands and uses. You want to keep your tracking documents together, stored and labeled well. You want to keep folders with things like your interview protocols, your interview tracking, your raw data, your transcripts from your audio files. You might have, a separate folder for your audio files and then for your transcripts. But again, you want to be sure that when you do store these interviews or the transcripts of your audio files, that you're not including any identifying information. You don't want to say John Doe interview from January 24th. You can say participant number 75, right? So that you're not identifying who it is in the interview, either in the audio file or in the transcript. So just to recap this chapter, we've started collecting our data now. We've started our evaluation process. We want to get consent first. Then we want to use surveys, existing data, interviews, focus groups, observations, whatever method to actually collect our data. And then finally, once we've collected it, or as we're collecting it, we want to be sure that we're keeping it well organized so that it's useful.